Hey folks, I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for coming out. This is a short lecture covering a few housekeeping points, as well as, of course, issues in migration, forced migration, and the international refugee regime. I'll be going over some of the key points from your textbook chapter on this topic as a way of fleshing out the ideas and hopefully clarifying some of the arguments going on over there. So, there we go. In terms of housekeeping, thanks for getting the CEAs in for the course. They will be graded as soon as possible. Tests will open Thursday, just like tests and quizzes in this course have been so far. You will only be assessed on material since the midterm, so from the beginning of Module 4 onward. This is not a cumulative final where you have to cover everything from the beginning to the end of the class. Last but not least, course evaluations. Nice chance to earn a bonus point or two, but just as importantly, at least for me, is that it gives me feedback on how the course went from your point of view. What worked well, what could have been improved, and this is really valuable for improving the class for the next group of students that's going to go in through here taking SGS 101 either as an elective or as an SGS major or minor. So, in terms of the refugee regime, a few quick numbers I have on the slide over here. There are roughly 26 million refugees in the world, and we're going to get into that definition shortly. There are 48 million internally displaced persons. All told, there are about 86 million people in the world in basically forced displacement-like situations. That includes the 4.1 million who are asylum seekers, aka who have asked for asylum in a country that is a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention. We're going to get there. And as well as special considerations with populations that, particular populations like Syrians and Venezuelans living abroad who have not yet acquired residency or citizenship in another country, Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA, etc. So, quick definition. What is a refugee? Who is a refugee? Prior to 1951, in the international system, there are hints of a definition. I actually did my master's thesis partly on this, so I got to know the literature fairly well, but it's not terribly stable. 1951, the UN negotiates and eventually passes the Convention relating to the status of refugees. The wording here is really, really important. First, as a result of events occurring before January 1st, 1951, so it was very temporally limited. 2, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. As I have had lawyers and international experts in refugee law tell me many times over the years, a well-founded fear of being persecuted is an objective fear. What this means is that if you feel like you might be persecuted, but there is no objective basis for it, then it's not considered valid. The fear has to be grounded in what, generally speaking, would be considered reality for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And you have to be outside the country of your nationality and unable or unwilling to go back to that country. So, let's think about what this definition says, and let's think about what it doesn't say. If you have a well-founded fear of losing your life due to a civil war or due to gender-based violence, that does not necessarily entitle you to refugee protection in the sense of the convention. And you might be asking, well, why did we, the global we here, negotiate such a narrow and tightly tailored definition? And the answer is simple. It was the Cold War. Western powers were interested in getting certain kinds of refugees, people who could reasonably be claimed to have been persecuted by communist states. They did not, and they were not interested in expanding the definition more broadly. So the Cold War really shapes the definition of who is exactly a refugee or a desirable refugee, and this is going to shape the nature of the system going forward in a very profound and radical way. As your book actually does talk about this a fair amount as well, and sort of explains some of this background a little bit too. The definition spreads, and in part, some of these kind of narrowly tailored early origins do expand over the course of time. It's a very lawyerly definition. 1967 protocol to the 1951 convention removes the geographic and temporal restrictions. 1967 protocol basically says that it is no longer limited to events before the 1st of January 1951 and no longer limited to Europe. 1974, the Organization for African Unity adopts a more open definition, which includes displacement as a result of war, external aggression, etc. The Cartagena Convention in 1984 does much the same thing for Latin America. As you see here from a quotation from the convention, the term refugee shall apply to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, etc., etc. And bit by bit, regional organizations like this, regional groups, start to expand the definition to make it a little bit more in keeping with what's actually going on in the world. Because what's actually going on is that there are a lot of people who are displaced, who fear for their lives, who have some sort of a well-founded fear of persecution or a well-founded fear of violence or a well-founded fear of basically being in a very dangerous situation, but who do not in any technical way meet the 5 conditions of the 1951 convention. Bit by bit, the international system starts to change. And we get this move over the years, and I'm kind of skipping ahead over here quite a long way, from the idea of refugees and the idea of studying refugees, the idea of focusing on refugees, to the much broader category of forced migration. And forced migration is an expansion of this initial refugee concept, focusing on diverse categories of people forced from their homes, internally displaced people, so people who are displaced within one country. They have not actually left the country from which the country in which they encountered violence and in which they were displaced. Stateless people, due to multiple factors. Natural disaster-induced displacement, development-induced displacement, as we saw in our prior module. As a result, UNHCR has become a far more complex humanitarian agency than it was 70 years ago. And this is something I do want to point out, because the UNHCR has lots of problems. All intergovernmental agencies like this are always going to have lots of problems. The world is not a perfect place. I know this comes as a big shock. But all jokes aside, there are lots and lots of people who in all likelihood literally are alive and have had their lives saved by the protections and offices of UNHCR, who otherwise might have come to a much more tragic end. So I don't want to give the impression that this is a horrible or terrible regime and that it's never done any good for anybody, because that's not the case. At the same time, EU states, European Union states in particular, and in general states in Europe and North America more broadly, have largely chosen to focus on security-driven approaches to forced migration. There's a long story here that we could theoretically get into, but to keep this nice and concise. After the Cold War, after 1989, essentially in the European Union, or then it was the European Economic Community, it was the security experts who effectively were writing policy on migration. The European Union itself was actually not very well equipped to deal with these questions. And so they wound up basically giving the whole thing over to European security agencies that then defined what EU, EEC, and then ECC, and then EU policy would look like. Limiting spontaneous arrivals, using buffer states, and sometimes engaging in outright criminality to limit refugees' access to EU and North American states. This tendency is known in the literature as securitization. It means adopting a framework through which forced migration is first and foremost a security problem to be solved, as opposed to a humanitarian disaster that needs the engagement and collaboration of regional partners, NGOs and INGOs, etc., in order to actually make headway through it and try to address some of its worst effects. And this has really led to a number of very, very tragic, very horrifying in lots of cases situations. In the case of the EU in particular, basically the European Union has been spending a lot of money hiring former human smugglers, people who used to be involved in the business of smuggling people from usually poorer, more violent countries into the EU, and turning them into a kind of impromptu migration police. And Libya in particular has been sort of the ground zero for this, where you have basically militias intercepting migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, either selling them into slavery, no, I'm not actually joking, or expelling them back somewhere into the Sahara, or refouling them, to use the technical term, somewhere into the Sahara, where, unsurprisingly, many of them wind up dying. Individual EU member states have earmarked tens of millions of dollars more as they keep on focusing on solutions like this. And this is actually a process which I'm going to only touch on briefly here, which is actually documented in some relatively recent and excellent quality news articles. One by Peter Tinti from 2007, one by Trilling from 2015. I have the references at the end of the slideshow. But this entire process of kind of offshoring, detention, warehouse, processing, and return, and so basically treating refugees and forced migration as a security problem, has really been, in lots of ways, a very grave catastrophe for the way the EU has tried to approach migration, and I would personally argue for the EU's influence in neighboring states, in neighboring countries, across the Mediterranean, and so forth. So this gives you just a quick idea of some of the issues that are going on here and how they've been important and how they've been influential. And one of the examples I kind of think is really telling is from a blog post from a few years ago, but I still think it's quite relevant, which is that basically, in lots of ways, refugees and forced migrants are people who, in the context of truly dislocating violence, make a life-altering choice to act for themselves without resorting to violence. And the entire notion that all of a sudden an effective humanitarian refugee policy could actually be an effective tool of nonviolent advocacy has been completely lost in EU, and I don't want to cast the EU as the only kind of bad actor here, because there are lots of others as well, but I do know more about the European Union in some ways and about other parts of the world, has really cast the EU into a situation where they've been punishing precisely those very people who have chosen nonviolence and made a nonviolent choice in the face of very, very violent, destabilizing circumstances. Last but not least, here are a couple of references. There are many, many more if you dig around, but these are the ones that have really influenced my thinking, and I wanted to share them with everybody here. I will also link to them on the module page for this module of the class. I hope this has been helpful. As always, folks, feel free to post any questions.